Welcome back to this training on building Microsoft Teams apps and solutions. As a reminder, you can post your questions in the Q&A panel during the live session, and our team will answer your questions there. Yesterday, we covered building apps and solutions with Microsoft Teams. Today, we will cover extend your solution with Microsoft Graph. Now let's move on to our topic, extend your solution with Microsoft Graph, where we'll be covering the following: automating Teams lifecycle management, messages, webhooks, and resource-specific consent.
Hi, welcome to Graph APIs for Microsoft Teams. I'm Nick Kramer. Here we'll cover automating team lifecycles, being able to create new teams and manage them. We'll cover messaging. We'll talk about webhooks to hear about changes to your messages. And we'll talk about an upcoming feature called resource-specific consent, or RSC. Microsoft Graph is our unified API endpoint for dealing with data. So there's a Graph endpoint for Exchange, for SharePoint, for Teams, for Planner, for a whole variety of different Microsoft products, all exposed under a common API endpoint. And Teams allows you to build a variety of different apps, and you can think of Graph as yet another type of application you can build with Teams. You can build tabs, bots, connectors, etc., and you can build Graph apps using Teams. But another way to think about Graph is that you can use Graph inside of those different types. You can use Graph inside of a tab. You can use Graph inside of a bot, etc. And you can build entirely new types of apps using just Graph. So you can have a website running outside of Teams that's powered by Graph and using team data. Similarly, you can have a service that has no UI whatsoever running Graph and getting access to team data. You can even have command line tools that access Graph and use that team data. One of my favorite things to do with Graph is to automate team lifecycles. You can create a team, add members and owners to the team, configure the team settings, add your channels, install apps, add some tabs to those channels, send messages to let people know the team is ready, and then you can just use the team. It's fully set up. You just had to write a few APIs, and with a click of a button, now your team is ready to go. And after people have used the team for a while, the team's run its course, you can then archive the team or delete it. And we have a full set of permissions to do this with. We have both user-delegated permissions and application permissions. Just to get a little wonky here, user-delegated permissions is when you're doing work on behalf of a user. So when you have a signed-in user, you're using user-delegated permissions. This is really the default mode you should be working in. When in doubt, use user-delegated. We also support application permissions, where there's no signed-in user at all. It's just the application by itself, almost an autonomous application that the admin set up and let run in a box in a corner for the rest of the year. And those applications are really powerful. And the downside is they're really powerful. They have access to all the data in the tenant, not just one user's worth of data. So you do need that admin to go and approve those apps. So really powerful when you need it, but if you don't need it, use user delegated. The approach for getting a token for those is slightly different. You need a token to call APIs. You need to first authorize, get the signed in user. Basically, there's SDKs for this, but it comes down to this API call. You do a get, you do this long URL, you have to pass in the tenant, your app ID for user delegated, you have to pass in which permission scopes you're interested in. And then the remaining these are parameters are how would you like to deal with what happens after the user has logged in. So the user logs in, types in their password, approves the app, gives consent to the app if necessary. And then once that's all done, you jumps to your app's redirect URI, passes in the state to that application, and continues what that app was doing before the login was required. With application permissions, it's a much simpler flow. It's a single HTTP post. You pass in the necessary data, you get a response back that has the token, you're done. You have to pass in the tenant, you pass in an app ID. Unlike user delegated, you also pass in an app secret because the response is in the post. And you can pass in a list of scopes. You have to say something about the scopes. For application permissions, you almost always just say, use the scopes that this app was registered with, which is what this is saying here, HTTPS encoded / graph.microsoft.com/default. Yeah, use whatever permissions I set up when I registered this application in the app registration portal. So let's show that off here. All right, let's see a demo of this. So here is Contoso Airlines, the largest airline you've never heard of, running nonstop flights daily to Redmond. They run their business by creating a new team for every flight they fly, as in every day they're creating new teams for those routes. And that adds up to a lot of teams. So to do that, they've automated the creation of those teams. They will use Graph APIs to, during midnight, they will create all those teams. And so this being a sample app here for demoing, we also allow you to switch between user delegated and application permissions because you can do all these things in both modes. We'll just use user delegated or our application permissions here and show off how this works. So when we create teams, it'll look at its flight roster and then start creating appropriate teams. So we will first, you have to get yourself an authenticated Graph client. We've already logged in, but that's just your SDK call that says, hey, give me a token, hook that up to the future requests I'm going to do. When you create a team, you need to figure out who you're going to put in that team. And so our first step is we have our hard-coded list of users that we're going to use. The flight captain, the flight administrator are going to be the owners of that team. And we're going to do a get user from UPN call, which is up here, which is really just make a Graph call to /users/UPN and then return those objects, because that will be the easiest way for us to find out the object ID for those users, a GUID basically. Do that twice, once for each user. We'll then do the same thing for the crew, who are going to be members of the team rather than owners of the team. We'll just map those all together, join that. And then we have a list of members. We can concatenate that into a nice array. We'll go over that. All right, now that we know who we're going to put in that team, let's actually create the group. Every team is backed by a group. Group is the underlying access control mechanism for teams. Every team resides within a group. Your SharePoint resources also reside within a group. Your planner also resides within that group. So lots of different resources reside within a group. So the first step to creating a team is creating that group that backs it. And so we're going to create our team. It's going to have all the properties you expect. It'll have a display name. It'll have a mail alias. We'll have a description. We have to specify the visibility, whether we want a public team that anyone can join or a private team that's invitation only. For all teams, you end up, the group type is always the same for all teams. It's always unified. Mail enables always true. Security enables false. And then we need a way to pass in the owners. So we'll do this with one little Graph trick. If you can also add these later after the group has been created, but if you want to do it all in one call, you can do this interesting little syntax of owners at odata.bind, and then you pass in the URLs for all the owners. So fully qualified URL, graph.microsoft.com/users/quid. And when we do that, we'll create our group in memory, and then we'll actually send this over to Graph. And then we'll see nothing on the right side because there's no team associated with it yet. There's a group, but no team. So let's create that. Let's create a team. It's ultimately this comes down to post/groups/ID/team, or sorry, put/groups/ID/team. And when we create the team, we've already got most of the interesting information there. If we want to, we can specify some additional settings. This is strictly optional. We'll specify the settings of allowing members to create and update channels and delete channels. So we set those to false. We'll disallow those. And now when we run that, we'll see that Flight 157 has now come into existence. But so far, it's just an empty channel or empty team with no channels to speak of. We can fix that. We can also add channels. Again, with one post, we're posting to /teams/ID/channels. The team ID, by the way, is the same ID as the group ID. So I get to keep that nice and simple. Channels are simple constructs. They really just have a display name and a description is kind of the minimum set of things you need there. And we'll do that. We'll see a new channel pop into existence. Check out our cool channel. We can turn around and add tabs to it. We will create a map tab showing where the airport is. Our tab will have a display name. We will need to bind it to a particular application. Again, we do one of those funny Teams apps at odata.bind. That's our magic syntax for saying it's an existing entity in Graph. We're not creating a new Teams app. It's an existing Teams app. We have the fully qualified URL to that application. In this case, the application is com.microsoft.teamspace.tab.web. It's a website tab. So its application ID is actually com.microsoft.teamspace.tab.web. And so if you had a different app ID, you can just plop that in there. We will also we'll configure the tab as well as just put a little tab placeholder. If you leave off these parameters, you don't get a very interesting tab. So we will specify entity ID is null for tab, for website tabs. Content URL is the URL you want to show in your website tab. You can then provide an alternate website URL for the website URL is what happens if you click on the show me this in a browser button. If you feel like it, you can have a different URL here than you do for the content that you see inside Teams. And then remove URL will be lazy and not do anything special when you remove this. Actually, it's not lazy at all for a website tab. There's nothing useful to do there. And when we do that, we will create a new tab. We'll see it pop over there on the left in just a minute. Here's our map tab. Takes a moment to propagate. And here we go. Here's a nice map of the airport. They fly the airplanes in right over here. We can also create SharePoint stuff. How about we create a SharePoint list in this team? We will get the site that corresponds to this team, /groups/ID/sites/root. If you're doing this quickly, you can sometimes end up trying to get the site before it's been created. So I put in a little retry logic here. I just, if at first you don't succeed, try a few more times, delay about 30 seconds between them, you're good to go. If you do it slowly in an interactive demo like I'm doing, you don't really need the retry. Next, we actually create the SharePoint list. We need to specify a name for the list, challenging passengers. We need some columns. Each column is a name of a field and a definition. They're all going to be text. So we're going to have a name, seat number, and notes columns. And with that post, we'll create the underlying data, but there's nothing to view the data. We don't have a nice tab to view the data in. All right, we'll create that tab, and then we will, that last call was we needed to actually add a little bit of data to the list to be interesting. Now we'll actually create a tab for it all. And I think that's the last thing that app is going to do for there. All right, so we'll go to the challenging passengers. And we can open up this item in the list. And it turns out the challenging passenger is me because I snore loudly when I fall asleep. So I guess I got to work on that. So another trick here is installing apps. We could have installed an app when we created that team, but I wanted to show off an additional trick you can do, which is installing apps to a whole bunch of different teams. Suppose you settle on a new surveying application for your tenant, say SurveyMonkey, and you want to deploy it to all your teams. Well, you can do that with Graph. So here we'll show that off. We have our app ID already identified. SurveyMonkey's GUID is something, something, something. And what we're going to do is we're going to enumerate all teams, and we're going to filter them down to only the ones that are flight teams, flight 157, just to keep this demo going here in a reasonable amount of time. We will, to get all teams, we first, the way you get all teams is literally you get all groups that have teams in them. So what you do here, and for demo purposes, we had a switch there to do it slightly differently if you're using user delegated, but they both work in both modes. It's literally get/groups, and then you select the properties that you care about, ID, resource provisioning options, and display name. I believe resource provisioning options is one of the properties that groups does not return by default, which is why we did the select here. Get that information, and then filter it out to groups that contain a resource provisioning option equal to team. So if a group has a resource provisioning option of team, it's a group that contains a team. And so that's what we return. We return a list of groups that contain teams. Those groups have the same IDs as the teams that are in those groups. And so we effectively have a list of IDs, a list of team IDs. Now we iterate over those teams. We will retrieve the information for that team and check to see if it's archived. If the team has been archived already, it's in a read-only mode, because that's what archiving is, a read-only mode. And we can't install apps to a team that's in a read-only mode, so we skip it. But eventually, if we run this long enough, we'll find a team that has not been archived and needs an app in it. And so then what we're going to do is check to see if the app has already been installed, because someone might have already been a fan of SurveyMonkey. We will read /teams/ID/installed apps. We will, while we're there, expand out the subproperty teams app definition so we don't have to make yet another call. And if there's only one entry, or if there's 0 entries in the app definitions that match our query here, we have a query at the end of this long line. The query is here. If the app definition, if we don't have any app definitions that have the ID, it means that app has not been installed and we need to install it. So then we do that. We post to /teams/ID/installed apps, and we pass in another one of those funny @odata.bind references. We're effectively passing in teams app @odata.bind equals this long string. /app catalog /teams app /app ID. And when we do that, we will install SurveyMonkey into that team. And then SurveyMonkey recognizes that it's been installed. It sends us some helpful information. And then you can go ahead and do that for however many teams you feel like. We'll just do it for one team. Here, SurveyMonkey was installed for a particular team, but it's not available for use outside of that team. I'd like to install an app here. How about we install Adobe for all our users so that Adobe app can message us, send a proactive message whenever that app has something it needs to tell us. So we have our breakpoint set up. Get back over here. Let's install to all users, and it'll be a similar flow where first we're going to get a list of users. We're going to select the properties we care about, the ID and the display name. So that's really the only parts of the user list we care about. For demo purposes, we're going to filter this to a subset of users. We're going to only do users whose display name starts with mod, which happens to be the account I'm running this with. Jump to that. All right, and again, first step we do is that app already installed for this person? So we query /users/ID/teamwork/installed apps. And like we did previously, we're going to expand out the Teams app definition to see if it's, so we don't have to do a subsequent call. And we're then going to do a fancy filter. And we're basically saying, tell me only about installed apps who have a Teams app definition whose Teams app ID equals this big GUID up here. And when we do that, we'll find out that, hey, that collection of Teams apps that have that app ID installed for this person is 0. That means we need to install it. And there we go. We will post to /users/ID/teamwork/installed apps. We will pass in another cool Teams app at odata.bind equals /app catalog /Teams apps /app ID. We'll do that. We won't get the instant satisfaction like we did with the other one because we will need to restart the Teams client to see this take effect. Hit F5 over here, refresh, wait for it. Then we'll go over here into .. menu. And now we have Adobe Creative Cloud installed where it wasn't before. And we have the ability for them to send us notifications and otherwise chat with us. All right, and so that's a good way to deploy an app, get a bot out to a whole bunch of different users. It can also be used with tabs, but it's especially useful with bots because this allows bots to now send you messages. We call those proactive messages. All right, that concludes that demo segment. So just to recap, some of the APIs we have available in V1 today, we have APIs for working on teams, for doing members and owners, for dealing with team settings, channels, tabs. We showed apps that are installed into a team. We showed apps installed for a particular user. And we didn't even talk about app catalog except in passing. The app catalog is the list of apps in the store along with the list of apps in your tenant catalog of apps. So we have full APIs for accessing those. Next, let's talk about messaging. There's a couple different things that people like to do with messaging. I'll divide this into user-delegated scenarios and application permission scenarios, although the reality is there's a little bit of overlap here. One of the common things people like to do is, I'll call them super-powered bots. Bots that can see messages they weren't mentioned on. And you might have a bot that listens to all messages in a channel all the time and just decides whether there's something relevant. It notices someone's talking about stock prices, and so it might volunteer the stock price. Or you might have a bot that under certain circumstances needs to, when it was asked a question, it needs to go back and read previous messages to understand what that question is referring to. Both of those things are things you can do with Graph APIs. Another common pattern we see is temporary teams and temporary channels. We saw the flight team. Oftentimes when you're done with a team or done with a channel, before you delete it, you want to save off the contents so you can use Graph APIs to read all the messages away and save those off. You can do a lot of workflow automation using aka Flow, aka Microsoft Power Automate. You can also just use raw graph calls. You don't have to use Flow. You can do a lot of different workflows, including some of them are as simple as an out of office message. Hey, the members of this team are out of office on an offsite If you send us a message, we will automatically reply to you, or it could be much more sophisticated than that. On the application permission side, again, some workflow scenarios are better with application permissions, especially if you want to be responding to stuff while no one's around, when there's no user logged in. Another thing we see a lot of is enterprise information archiving. People who want to make a backup for compliance reasons of all the messages in a channel. That's a very common thing we see. Data loss prevention is another one where you want to run some kind of automated logic on new messages and see, hey, are there any credit card numbers or social security numbers or other things that really shouldn't be posted here? You can do data loss prevention that way. And then analytics is another scenario we see a lot where people build some kind of statistics to show which teams are getting the most usage, which teams are not getting a lot of usage, who's talking to who, what kind of things are they saying, and kind of bubbling up some statistics about adoption. All right, so let's see an example of this in action. We have the team meeting channel where we have a live Q&A session, and people will ask their questions in here in the channel. And there's going to be a lot of people asking a lot of questions. So we want an app that will keep track of what are the open questions, which ones have been liked the most, so we're answering the most important ones first, and whether they've been answered or not. And we see that when the page loads, it reads the list of questions. Are we moving offices? How many likes they've gotten, and keeps track of which ones have been answered. All right, back to our slides. So that's a quick demo of some of our messaging APIs. We have a great set of APIs for dealing with channel messages. You can read them, you can send them, with the help of bots, you can send them with application permissions. We also have webhook notifications for new messages. And we have support for at least reading images and messages, sending not so much. For chats is a little more limited. We have a pretty good set of APIs for user delegated permissions, much more limited when reading with the application permissions. There's some fairly serious limitations around being able to enumerate chats. If you have a particular chat in mind, you can read it. If you have a particular message in mind, you can read it. If you want to know all the chats that are available, that's not something we can answer with application permissions. So that's something to keep in mind there. And then we have a good set of APIs for dealing with the membership on chats as well. Let's talk about webhooks. We saw some of those in action. We have webhooks for both chat and channel messages. You can subscribe to a per channel webhook, which is, listening to one channel. You can subscribe to a per chat webhook, listening to one chat thread, or you can subscribe to what we call the Firehose webhook. Give me all the channel messages or all the chat messages. And when you subscribe, you can ask for new messages, for edited messages, and deleted messages. You'll get replies as well as root messages, and you'll hear about reactions. One caveat is that the /all messages and /chats all messages and /teams all messages, all this is in preview, but the all messages Firehose version, there may be some licensing changes in the future. So think about that and read up on the latest before you make decisions on what you invest in there. One of the nice things about Teams notifications, unlike other graph webhooks, is that Teams notifications have message data. Most graph notifications work by, they tell you, hey, something changed, but we're not going to tell you what changed. Why don't you go do another API call to see what changed? The Teams messaging APIs will tell you what changed. There's a new message. Here's the message. And the way we send that is in the data portion of the encrypted content. And so if you run the decryption algorithm, you will get back exactly the resource you'd get if you did a HTTP GET call to this resource. So we saved you that round trip. As we alluded to in the previous slide, these notifications, because they have extra data, they are extra sensitive, and we've put additional security measures in place to control that data. First, again, we've encrypted that data so that only the right application can get access to that data. Second, every callback we give has a validation token. It's basically for you to prove that that callback came from Graph and not some attacker who happened to know your callback URL. That's actually a standard part of Graph, but it's more important when you're doing these notifications that have payloads, because there's actually something you can do with it without calling back into Graph. There's also a periodic authorization challenge. The way this works is when the subscription is created, Graph runs its authorization logic and says, is this app allowed to access this data? And then what happens after that is periodically, say every hour or two, Graph will send what we call an authorization challenge. It's basically a callback that says, hey, prove you're still authorized. Send us a token that has permission to keep on reading data. And so that's something you'll respond to for these types of notifications. And finally, since this is the ability to read messages in a tenant, all messages in a tenant, you'll need to go through that same protected API process that you go through in order to do it with polling APIs. To get webhook notifications about a message, you need the same protected API access as you'd use for application permissions for reading the message using a GET API. So I want to tell you about a new feature that we're working on called resource-specific consent. It's not available yet, but we're working hard on it, and hopefully it'll be available soon. So the app I just showed, Q&A tracker, requires a fairly high level of permission. It needs to be able to group read write all, or group read all, sorry, in order to get those messages. So it needs the permissions to read all groups in order to read the messages in this one team. And so if you're a typical user and you're the first person to run this app, what you're going to see is a screen that says, no, you're not allowed to run this. You need the admin approval to run this app. Group read all is just too big a permission in order to run by yourself. And so what you have to do is you have to track down an admin, figure out who the global admin is for your tenant, and then go convince them to give you access to group read all. Read in this case, group read and write all, because, wow, that's good luck even convincing him of that, because that's a fairly intensive permission. So we've working on an alternative we call resource-specific consent. Instead of giving this app access to all teams and all groups, how about we give it access to one group? And we have a way to do that. So let's take a look at what the resource-specific consent version of this app looks like. There's more than one way to install an app, and we're going to do it this way. We're going to side load it, because this is an app under development, and that's the easiest way to do it. We will upload a custom app from this screen. And now, the thing to notice here is this is just a normal Teams app. I go to the privacy and permissions section. The only thing weird about this is you will see some permissions that you've never seen in a Teams app before. Read messages in this team, read this team's members, maintain access to this team's data. Other than this, it's just a Teams app. So when we add it, that app will now have access to the messages in this team. It will have access to the members of this team. It will be able to do these things when no one's logged in, maintain access. So it's just a Teams app that has extra powers. And so that's what resource-specific consent ultimately is. Your Teams apps now can do stuff they could never have done before in a practical way. So let's walk through what we had to do that. In our Solution Explorer, we have our Teams app manifest. And this is just a normal Teams app manifest for a tab app, with one exception. We've added this web application info section. This section specifies what is the Graph app ID that we registered with Azure Active Directory. And it has a list of resource-specific permissions: channel message.read.group, member.read.group. And then by virtue of having anything in here, we get the maintain access when no one's around permission. Because these are actually application permissions rather than user delegated permissions. And so that's what we had to do to the manifest. And then when we went to request the token, we just did this the same as we would have any other any other application permission token. We posted to that auth site and got back an application permission token, a token that only had access to one team because it's only been installed in one team. If team owners were to turn around and install it in additional teams, that app would have access to additional teams. But the which teams does it have access to, you don't need to say that when you're requesting a token. You get a token that gives you access to whatever you have access to. And then once you have that token, you got the token the way you normally get a token, you use the token the way you normally use a token. So the only thing we changed here is that manifest. So here are some of the new permissions that we've added. Probably the most interesting on this bunch is being able to create and delete channels and the ability to read messages as well as be notified of new messages. The ability to read and the ability to be notified of messages are the same permission. But you can also read settings. You can also look at membership. In the future, we will be supporting the ability to add members and owners to a team. Deleting tabs, editing tabs, creating tabs is also supported. Now, some tricks and tips with working with resource-specific consent. The motto of this feature is team owners grant access to team data. So only the team owner is privileged enough to be granting access to a team. It's up to the team owner to decide whether the app is able to use team data. That's what makes them a team owner. I should also caveat that by saying the admin gets to decide which team owners to trust. An admin can say, I like all team owners can do this. The admin can say, there's only 5 team owners in this organization I trust. And the admin can say, no, there's 0 team owners I trust. So the admin always gets the final say in this. But by default, team owners are allowed to grant access to team data. Another key point there is that this is team data. Chats are not team data. Private channels are not really team data in the same sense either, because the team owner doesn't necessarily have access to all private channels. And so we can't let the team owner give consent for stuff that the team owner can't get access to. Finally, you can't use resource-specific consent on a team that doesn't exist yet. You can't use resource-specific consent to create teams because there's nothing to consent to because it doesn't exist yet. Other things to call out here, these are application permissions. They're not user-delegated permissions. So you will be running outside the context of a given user. So if you want your app to be restricted by what the calling user can do, you'll want to implement that logic yourself. I'll also call out that the one resource that I most miss is files. You can access files using file.read.all instead of using an RSC permission, but there is no RSC permission for using files. I'll also call out here that you can freely mix and match permissions. You can have an app that uses RSC permissions and uses classic user delegated permissions or classic application permissions. You can get multiple tokens. You can have a single token that has both your classic application permissions and your RSC application permissions, and use those as you see fit. And the final thing I'll just say is that keep track of all your app IDs. When you start to build these apps, there will be a lot of app IDs flying around. You can actually reuse a lot of them. Your team's app ID can be the same as your graph app ID if you want. And you can also use your bot app ID as the same value for all 3 of those. And so that's something to consider to keep some sanity. The other thing to think about is make sure that different applications, different teams apps don't point to the same graph app. We we have the limit that you can't have 2 apps installed in the same team that have the same graph app ID. And really, you probably ought to think about that as a more global restriction as well. Like it starts to hurt your brain when you have multiple Teams apps that all point to the same graph app. So, make life easier on yourself and don't do that. Just one-to-one mapping, one Teams app, one graph app. All right, and with that, I'm going to close it on up. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us for today's training. See you tomorrow, where we'll cover the following: building Teams apps using solution accelerators.